Hello, everyone. Welcome back. For those, some of you might know, but for those who don't, I recently took down a Legacy Super Qualifier earlier this week. And while I didn't record my matches, I felt they kind of played worse when I was recording, and I wanted to really focus on this event. I did want to take some time and kind of do a deeper dive into one of the more interesting matches I played. So this is going to be a pseudo mirror. I'm on my Bant red list. My opponent is on the more standard, four color list with black in the main. I wanted to go through the recording, kind of pause it during important moments, talk about my thought process, and also maybe talk about some of my card choices as far as deck selection, maybe why I like some of the cards I like. For those who have tried to step through a Magic Online replay, it's not the best at doing that. So what I've done is I've kind of recorded the replay all the way through, and I'm going to look through that and pause at specific moments where I want to kind of take a deeper dive. So let's just jump right into it. Okay, so right off the bat on turn one, my opponent leads with Island Astrolabe. So it's pretty obvious what the match is going to be. It's going to be a longer inning game. You're going to want to try and get maximum value off your cantrips. Line up your forces well, stuff like that. And so in this instance, I think one of the main differences between my build and what the opponent is playing is that they play Sylvan Library in the main, and so I decided that it was more important to leave up Spell Snare than to, play Astrolabe or Ponder. It's also a little bit nice that the longer you wait on Ponder, the more information you have about what you want to get with it. So for those reasons, I decided to just play a land and pass the turn. I'm instantly rewarded. My opponent goes for the turn 2 library, and I have the answer for it. So that worked out really well. An unanswered library, especially early in the game, can, really take over the game. So here I decided to ponder. I think Coatl is really good. Swords can be good, kind of to get rid of an Uro, but I think it's a little too early in the game to be thinking about that. So I just decided to take the Coatl and shuffle away the other two. Then I play Astrolabe here to develop my mana and get through my deck. On my turn 3, my opponent plays an Uro. Very solid turn 3 play. Get to drop with the land in. They ponder. They choose not to shuffle. And here I have a tough decision where I can hold up Coatl and Swords, so like say they have an Oko, or I can play the Narset out. And I think that Narset doesn't line up well against an Oko my opponent might have here, because they can just elk their Astrolabe and kill it right away. And so originally my plan was going to be to hold up Coatl. But then I kind of decided that my opponent likely would have played Oko on turn 3 if they had it, just because it's a better play versus a tapped out opponent than Uro is. Oko plays with the board. The longer it's in play, the more value it gets. Uro's value is kind of static, at least the front half is. So for those reasons, I kind of decided my opponent wasn't likely to have an Oko, and even if they did, there's some chance that Narset finds a Force of Will. So I decided to take the risk and play it. It does find a Force of Will, which is nice. Gives me a little bit of feeling of protection, and I get maximally rewarded because my opponent did have a Jace. So Narset is stopping Jace from brainstorming, which is great here, obviously. And if something does happen to the Narset later on, I have the Council's Judgment for the Jace too, which is really nice. Flusterstorm's a good pickup here. I find Teferi off the Narset activation. There was a other option of Force or Ponder. I think that, since we already have a Force and, so we don't really need a second one. And Teferi is just like a much better card than Ponder. Teferi would be probably one of the cards I'm looking for off of the Ponder. So I'm just going to take the Teferi. And it's nice that I have, 4 mana Teferi and Flusterstorm to protect it. Now here I have an interesting decision where my opponent goes to Cling, one of my spells, just as a cantrip. And I'm in this sort of awkward spot where I could Flusterstorm it. Just to 1-for-1 with my Flusterstorm. Because right now if Teferi resolves, bouncing the Astrolabe to my hand forces me to discard a card. But in the end, I decided that, getting Teferi down is probably what's the most important thing here. And draw 2, discard 1, kind of, when my opponent is on 3 cards in hand, I think is a perfectly, reasonable line and is still very likely to win me the game. So I decided to just have the most amount of protection for this Teferi instead of, not having to go to discard if it resolves. And I should say that the reason I want to bounce the Astrolabe right away is because my opponent could have something like an Abrupt Decay. And at that point, I would want to, if they Abrupt Decay the Teferi, then I don't get any value off of it. So that's why I wanted to bounce the Astrolabe right away. So you do a little trick here. You can float snow mana, turn regular mana into a snow mana with your Astrolabe, and then replay it. I wanted to leave up the Trop because it represents Veil of Summer. Whereas if I had left up a snow-covered island, it lets me play the Flusterstorm that I have, but it also, makes it obvious that I don't have Veil of Summer in my hand. So we have to go to discard. We discard an extra land. It's fine. And this is, I think, a point of the game where I just kind of want to point out just the power of these Planeswalker statics. So just like the combination of Teferi plus Narset is forcing my opponent to play this Coatl on their turn, and then they can't even draw the card with Narset, whereas normally they could do it on my end stuff and still get a card and pressure the Narset. And then, obviously, Narset is just completely taking over this game right now, where it's stopped a Coatl draw, it stopped an Uro draw, and it stopped 2 Jace Brainstorms. So the card has just been, single-handedly, winning the matchup for us right now. So here my opponent escapes Uro. I have a little thought about what I want to do in my end step. I decide to go with Council's Judgment on the Jace. And my thought process was, Jace is getting kind of close to ultimate, so I'm going to have to do this eventually. So I might as well be mana efficient now. When you have these Force Wills in hand that you're getting close to hard casting, it's nice to kind of maximize how you're using your mana each turn. Here, I made a small misstep. I didn't have a stop in combat, so I'm always going to Swords the Uro here, so I gave my opponent 3 life that they shouldn't have. Obviously, it's not really what the game is about, but it is just strictly worse, so I thought I'd point that out. Opponent has a Decay for the Narset, which indicates that they have a cantrip they want to play. They do have the Brainstorm, and here I decide to Flusterstorm the Brainstorm, just because on 6 mana, it's going to be hard for Flusterstorm to get value. So I want to use it now while I still can, basically. Also, if the opponent's last card is like a piece of counter magic, they can't brainstorm it away, which is nice. So here, I decide that I could be holding up these hardcast Force of Wills, but I'm so far ahead on card advantage, and Uro does take a long time to kind of get going that I felt it was just better to play out the Uro now. And it's fine to pitch a card to these Force of Wills just because I'm so far up on cards already, and I really just want to get down a threat that's going to win the game. And so again, kind of the same logic. I'm taking down Hardcast Force, but getting a threat into play. I have a choice here. Actually, let me back up like a few seconds. So Uro comes into play. It draws me a second Uro. And at this point, I have so many extra cards in hand. I'm going to have to go to discard. So I decide to play the Uro instead of the Astrolabe just because, they both cantrip, but Uro costs more mana, so kind of against the mana efficiency heuristic that I'm using here. At this point, the game is basically over. My opponent, is so far behind on board in cards in hand. There's not much they can do. My opponent packs it in. So I think this game one was a good example of how these planeswalkers with these activated abilities that give you card advantage, but also these passive abilities that can generate virtual card advantage are really powerful and kind of really important in these mirror matches. Even if Oko and Uro are maybe just kind of objectively more powerful, just as far as what they do, the virtual card advantage of the passives is really, really underrated a lot of times. And I think this game was a really good example of how important they can be. So yeah, I will jump into game 2. All right, so here we are. This is game 2. My opponent's on the play. Pretty obviously. This hand has no lands. Easy send back. The 6 is better. I decide to bottom a second Veil of Summer instead of a land, just because it's hard for Veil to get value if you're not using it to protect a threat, and so I decided that it's more likely for the second Veil to not be doing anything than it is for a third land to not be useful, especially with the 7's rec. Getting to 5 mana is going to be valuable. Opponent leads with a Ponder, very standard. Decide to fetch and play an Astrolabe. Teferi is a really good pickup. My opponent again has the turn 2 library. I don't have a way to stop it this time though, unfortunately. So right away it feels like we're a little bit behind. So we'll see kind of how the game progresses and how I can claw back from that. Opponent draws an extra card with library, plays an Astrolabe. then here's where I think I make a slight mistake on my next turn. If I know my opponent's deck list, I would have done this a little differently. Here I decided to play the fetch just to, because I have an extra fetch still, drawing a brainstorm will not really impede me from, putting 2 bad cards back and shuffling. And I wanted to thin my deck because I'm going to use Teferi to bounce this Astrolabe. Both of these cantrips don't have card selection, so it's really important to thin extra lands out of your deck when you're about to cast cantrips without card selection. But putting the 3rd card in my graveyard plays right into my opponent's John on the Lock. So that's a little frustrating. I think that card has not really been that popular in recent lists, and so it wasn't on my radar. But obviously it would have been nice to play around it. For what it's worth, there's an argument to maybe just pass that turn and not play anything, because next turn you can play Teferi with Veil backup. But I think that with Seven's Reclamation, you're going to be able to do that next turn. Play Seven's Rec with Veil backup. So I decided that I wanted to just start using my mana effectively. And it's not like holding up Veil is particularly valuable when you don't have anything else to back it up. You don't have like a Force of Will that you would use Veil to protect, things like that. So I decided to play out the Teferi. I should have not used the fetch land. My opponent draws a 2nd card with Library. So at this point, Library has been a +1 in pay life, which you would not play in Legacy. But, with the addition of Uro to these strategies and the fact that it's providing kind of a little bit of card selection too, it will be, it's good in these mirror matches. So my opponent does have the Uro, plays a land. They can't escape it quite yet, but if they fetch these 2 fetch lands, they will be able to. My opponent thinks about doing something and then chooses not to, I guess, which is what this pause in the replay represents. And on this turn, I think my play is pretty clear. I'm going to play Wreck and hold up Veil. My opponent has a Flusterstorm. Veil lines up really well into Flusterstorm, so that's nice for us. But my opponent also has the Force of Will, unfortunately. So this 7's Wreck gets countered. So at this point, before they pay the life here, the Veil or the Library has given them a +1, and the Force has lost them a card. So they should be about even, but obviously they can still use the Library to pay more life, and they're about to escape an Uro. So in their upkeep, we're about even, but obviously they have a lot more resources at their disposal than we do. My opponent fumbles to escape Uro. It's finicky. It's fine. They don't put a land into play, which is terrifying. But then they play a land for turn. So I assume it was drawn off the Astrolabe. So now I have a tough decision where I'm very behind, and I have to decide if I'm just going to Swords this Uro, or if I'm going to try and flashback 7's Wreck to bring back Teferi and a land, and use the land to Swords Uro. And I think, just using the Swords plain and simple plays around Flusterstorm, which is nice. And because the opponent doesn't know our other 2 cards are blank, it sort of plays around Force of Will or Force of Negation a little better, because, they might hesitate to spend a Force on a Swords, especially with, all this extra mana up. But I decided, because we don't actually have anything, and because we're a little bit behind, that I should kind of just go for the higher upside play, which is flashing back Reclamation. So that's what I do. And then I think we get a little lucky here. My opponent has a Veil that they're using in response, which is good. It makes sense for them to use it because they don't want their Uro to get bounced. But it's really lucky for us that they didn't have some sort of interaction. And this is especially great because since Seven's Rec is a white spell, they're not even drawing a card off of this Veil of Summer, so it's actually just a -1 for them, which is great. I decided to bounce the Astrolabe, get my value. This time I remember my beginning of combat stop, which is important because they would have drawn an extra card since Narset's not in play. My opponent this turn is able to play and escape an Uro in one turn. And they are, once again, at 20 life with a Sylvan Library in play. I think if I were my opponent, knowing that I was going to have this Uro, I probably would have been a little bit more aggressive with drawing library cards. That the life total is not under pressure at all right now. This Narset was an incredible draw here, shutting down both their library and their Uro. And then the Narset finds a library of my own, which I know will resolve because of Teferi. So that sequence of draws was just a very, very fortunate event. Here my opponent attacks, and then I have the Coatl to eat Uro in combat. And I want to take a quick second to just talk about how good the synergy between Teferi and Coatl is in a way that I think some people might underappreciate. So Coatl is, it's a 2-for-1, quote unquote, because it comes into play, draws a card, and then it trades with something. But I think there's an issue of conversion where, before the Coatl trades with either a creature or, like a kill spell from the opponent, it's not actually card advantage. It represents maybe card advantage in the future, but the actual 1/1 body doesn't really do much by itself, and it's not really a full card. And so having Teferi kind of guarantee that this turns into a 2-for-1 in the way that you want, which is to, get something off the board and draw a card, is so incredibly valuable. Even in some other matchups, like against like Delver Secrets, if they're attacking with like 2 Delvers and you play a Coatl and they lightning bolt it, even if it was a 2-for-1, it still feels like you're very behind in that situation because it wasn't a 2-for-1 in the way that matters, which, it was a 2-for-1 for cards in hand, but it didn't affect the battlefield at all. And so I think Teferi just does such an incredible job of converting Coatl the way you want it to convert, either cards in hand or, battlefield presence. So that's just something I wanted to point out, and it's really important here, because I'm sure my opponent has, Swords to Plowshares or Abrupt Decay or something like that, and they would love to kill this Coatl so they could kill one of my walkers, but they can't. We pick up an Uro. Goes great with Sylvan Library, so that's really nice. Because I'm playing it, I decided to take 8. And here, I finick with my mana a little bit. I know I just made fun of my opponent for finicking with their mana. I actually don't have anything to fetch with this Vista because I had sided out the second planes in sideboarding, and I didn't really know what I wanted to leave up. I decided that I wanted to leave up Astrolabe. At this point, I have a library that's active. My opponent doesn't. I have more cards in hand, and they decide to pack it in, which I think is fine. But yeah, so those were the games. I think that these games do a good job of highlighting just how valuable these extra planeswalkers are with their passive abilities, and maybe why you don't want to go all in on something like 4 copies of Uro, 2 or 3 copies of Library, which seems to be more towards what my opponent was going for there. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. This is my first type of kind of in-depth analysis video. If you see some lines that maybe I overlooked or didn't mention, definitely mention them in the comments. I love thinking about these sorts of things. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you all again real soon. Bye.